it's not what it says, they're going to get at me. No, if you had a magic wand.
Better.
Better. Okay. What's the first thing you would do to improve food equity?
I think I would do just what we talked about in the talk today in terms of having programs that actually align with dietary guidelines and being able to have parity for seafood throughout those programs. I think that will be a huge step. I think, helping people afford healthy food is so very important, and anytime there are studies on any sorts of programs that extend people's buying power for specific food groups, those are shown to be effective. So it's not necessarily, as maybe logistically difficult as trying to figure out how every cafeteria in America puts seafood on the menu twice a week, but giving people some sort of financial incentive to increase their intake of underconsumed nutrients that would probably be my first magic wand waving ceremony.
I heard financial incentive, financial support too, or did you mean to really say financial incentive? I
mean, just as we do with the fruits and vegetables programs, where people are able to double their dollar. If you were going to spend $5 on seafood and you'd get $10 worth for that, that would be the type of incentive that I'm talking about, and the type of incentive that the government already is doing with regard to the GusNIP program in fruits and vegetables.
And do we know, last one on this, do we know that these sorts of things are really barriers? Do we need education in things like how you cook seafood and store it and feed it to your kids and all that sort of stuff? Or is that a relatively small part of this problem? It's more getting the seafood in the door.
I think it's both and. I mean, any successful programs are looking at this whole socio-ecological model, which involves all layers of education, of changing the community, of changing individual factors. So, it's hard because sometimes if you're just pulling one lever, it may not be as effective, but it's important to pull them all.
Thank you very much. Okay, the next one is for Robert, and this is, in a way, a wide-ranging question. What's been the barrier for adoption? What is the barrier for adoption of aquaculture in the U.S.?
It's primarily regulatory. If we're talking primarily about finfish aquaculture, it's very difficult to be able to secure a permit for conducting aquaculture in the U.S. There's been efforts to try to work on that. There's been legislation that's being developed to help streamline that. It's been very challenging to get through that permitting process, and that's quite frankly led a lot of producers to look overseas for their production. And aquaculture here could be done in a smart and sustainable way. We know how to regulate and manage a sector well, and there's an opportunity to do it. I'm not going to say that there is an aquaculture industry here in the U.S. It's not like it's non-existent. It's a $1.5 billion industry here. We have a pretty solid shellfish and seaweed industry, or shellfish industry. There's room for that to grow. But yes, to a large extent, it's a missed opportunity to grow seafood domestically.
When regulation is a barrier, there usually is some reason that an industry or an activity is regulated away or blocked. And do you have insight into that? Is it? I'm not even sure where to go with that, but.
Yeah, I mean, there are environmental considerations to be very conscious of when developing aquaculture. There are historical impacts of the aquaculture sector, concerns around water quality, concerns around habitat, concerns around impacts to wild stocks. But I think the important point is the experience, the tools for management, the understanding how to manage that sector the right way has grown tremendously over the last 30 or 40 years, and there are smart ways and intelligent ways of doing it.
So it sounds to me like it would be expertise for responsible aquaculture
Yeah.
is where you're headed there.
That's the solution to regulating aquaculture well, is investing in the science, in the R&D programs that are necessary to develop and support an industry to grow in the right way. And we need more of that. It's almost like a chicken and the egg kind of thing here as well that's going on, right? We don't have an industry, so we haven't had the investment into, we don't have a huge industry, so we don't have the investment into it on the federal side to make that happen. But it needs much more, in my opinion, much more investment into this sector for all the reasons that we outlined, that Hugh outlined in my talk, and Maya's as well.
Thank you. Hugh, this one is something was on my mind. Beside eating more seafood and advocating for more seafood, what can we personally do now to support the blue food movement?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, Tom, for 3 years I was a pescatarian. And I became a pescatarian because I was intimidated by one of our fellow board members at the time. And as a New York lawyer, I had to stand up and tell him that I would eat nothing but seafood for the rest of my life. It lasted 3 years. It was wonderful. But what we need to, rather than having Detlef Schrempf come and intimidate everybody, what we need to do to encourage more blue foods in the future is along the lines of what I outlined. I mean, I think we need to focus on growing the aquaculture industry in the United States. If my understanding is correct, about 70% of it today is freshwater aquaculture, mostly probably catfish, trout, and tilapia. I think we can expand there. I think we can do that smartly. It's not an easy thing to do because unlike some other animal protein parts of the industry, it's far more balkanized and segregated. So there's really not a strong industry coalition to come together to drive the change that I think we need to see. I also think we need to do much more on the marketing front, in that we need to get into school feeding programs with seafood. We need to get in earlier with hospitality seafood. Today it's seen very much still as sort of a luxury and not a daily necessity. And I think we need to do some marketing campaigns to bring it on par with some of the other animal proteins.
So understanding is a big part of it. Is there a barrier from well, you've more or less already answered this, but I'll bring you back in, Robert, how might we improve aquaculture or support aquaculture with respect to the blue food movement, or is it all part of the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, aquaculture is a central part of the blue food movement for, just the various reasons. Wild stocks, right? We need to manage wild stocks better, but we're largely, capped out. We're getting about what we're going to get out of wild fisheries currently. We may grow it a bit with rebuilding programs, but if we're going to meet the demand for seafood sustainably, it's got to come through aquaculture.
Okay, I shift back over to Maya. Do we have examples of success stories in reducing food insecurity? Do we have any sort of models that we can sort of follow, for instance?
Well, what's really interesting is that
Besides your broccoli example, which I
besides my
love, I'm
broccoli
going to be quoting that one.
So what we just saw during the pandemic was a massive expansion of many of our social support programs. And what we saw was a dramatic decrease in child food insecurity during that time. When you give people money, even just the direct payments that went out to people, not SNAP or food stamps or any of that, just giving them money, the number one thing they spent it on was food. And the second thing was utilities. So when people are provided with additional supports, they will use it to meet those basic needs. And what we saw was, universal free school meals without any paperwork during the pandemic. We saw families come out of food insecurity. We saw, dramatic improvements. And now much of that has ended. Some states are continuing, but it was kind of a massive experiment during the pandemic in terms of being pretty generous with people in terms of expanding our nutrition support, and it worked.
Well, I personally wasn't aware that it's been that kind of a success story, so that makes it sound like it's really a resource limitation thing, and then the floodgates open and everybody can eat better and feed their kids better and pay for the heat.
Right.
Okay. Well, that's terrific. They handed me some more stuff here, but do we have any questions from either the web or the room? We've got one from Mike over here.
I think so. This actually is a kind of an observation, but a thought to drive you. In the land-based animals we talked about earlier, the feed to protein conversion is 3 pounds of feed to 1 pound of protein. In the aqua, it's 1.5 pounds of feed to 1 pound of fish, which means to me economically, you're going to get twice as much fish as you would chicken if you took the same amount of feed. So from a DSM perspective, you can grow your business and make money. From a global security on food, you'd actually have more fish than you would chicken. Just a place to grow.
And I wouldn't argue with you. What we need, though, is a robust and fulsome aquaculture industry in the United States that we can sell feed to. And we're a big purveyor of nutritional feed ingredients for layers and broilers and swine, and we'd love to serve an aquaculture industry here in the U.S. We're very connected, of course, to Scotland, Chile, Peru, and Norway, but we think we can do it here as well, and we should do it here.
I mean, yeah, that's just like a fundamental metric that shows how this can make business sense and economic sense. I think some of the barriers are, right, like the cost of feed are higher because the feed inputs are higher. We have issues with mortality, we have issues with disease. We're in a really early state of aquaculture, and it can get even a lot better and a lot more efficient over time as we start learning how to farm these species better, right? We're like, in the modern sense of aquaculture, we're only like 50 kind of years in. I mean, of course, aquaculture in some form has been practiced for 2,000 years, but really in salmon aquaculture, for example, 50 years in existence. Chicken, like 3,000 years of experience to get us to this point. So we can get a lot more efficient even than we already are.
Okay, Joe.
Oh, no.
Thank you all for your presentations. They are excellent. I had a comment and then actually 2 questions. And the first is that Michael Crawford has always noted that oysters have the same basic nutrient composition as brains, and as do most shellfish. So my comment is to also applaud you to say that shellfish, not only being a solution for feed conversion and protein, is also, when we take, I think, the most critical endpoint for humanity, ensuring adequate nutrition to the brain, is we need to keep front and center that critical role of shellfish production. And I think that should be as well highlighted and amplified in that usage. So the 2 questions are, number 1, Michael also said that he believes that because shellfish has shells, they are sequestering carbon from the atmosphere, and I want to know whether that's really true or not. And then secondly, to Maya, did you have a role of encouraging shellfish or clam or other shellfish consumption in your programs? And if you did you have any success?
So the first one sounded like it was on sequestering CO2, and then we'll go to Maya on that second one. So
there's been science on both sides of the equation on whether shellfish sequester carbon. I think it's been have leaned towards the more recent studies showing that it probably is not sequestering a significant amount of carbon. But there's a whole lot of reasons to like bivalve shellfish for a lot of different reasons, not the least of which is the water quality improvements, nutrient removal, water filtration, habitat provisioning through these farms. We lost 85% of our shellfish reefs. We can get some of that habitat back through farming this species. There's just so much to like about it.
And to your other question about encouraging clam consumption in my work, so I started my work as a renal dietitian in a low-income clinic outside of Atlanta, Georgia, where I was simply trying to get people not to eat at Checkers and to try to follow this complicated renal diet, which was really hard. And so I've also worked clinically at Providence Hospital in DC, which I think is closed now. But it's a very, again, low-income population, and so it was just kind of the basics of just trying to get people to understand that, ginger ale is also a soda. I don't drink soda, I drink ginger ale, or, I never use salt on my food, but I eat all this canned food and that's the kind of nutrition education I was able to provide. I still teach academically. I'm at George Washington University. So when I talk to my graduate students who are getting their master's in public health and taking a nutrition class, I talk a lot about seafood in that audience and context whenever I possibly can, because that is a nutrition science class and a receptive audience. And every semester I get the question, is it safe to eat farmed seafood? Aren't we all supposed to eat wild caught? And many of these misperceptions and questions abound, and I'm glad to be there to help answer them.
I'm going to suppress a comment I was going to make, because that actually is a great segue into another question, which is, with all the negative media on the seafood industry, do we have resources that we can turn to talk about how seafood is harvested in a sustainable way, between the aquaculture side and the wild? Do you use resources? Maybe this is for all three of you, but.
So I think there really is a need to produce more and better resources to promote the seafood industry under best practices, right? There's been more negative information that misinforms than there is positive information that guides us in the right way. There's an effort right now going on. Andrew Zimmern, David E. Kelly, and an organization called Fed by Blue is working on a multi-part series to help show and tell the story better on sustainable seafood production, which I think will be very positive, right? So we're involved with efforts like that. We try to, provide content advice on some of these efforts that are coming out, but we need to keep telling the story much better. And, we love the work of SNP that's trying to get out the messaging on the nutritional benefits. We and a number of other environmental partners are trying to get out the messages on the environmental end, but we all need to work together to do more on that.
Maya, anything you direct your students to?
Well, as a former FDA employee, I do send them to the FDA, EPA Fish Advice, and those wonderful infographics that we produced on seafood and children and seafood during pregnancy and lactation. So I use those a lot. Okay,
very good. So now I'll unsuppress my comment that comes from Joe's comment about shellfish and the brain. The humans, modern humans, had brain sizes that we have now probably 200,000 years ago, and there's a cave in southern South Africa that has evidence of 180,000 year old clam bake. So it's right on the coast, and there's evidence of fire and lots of use of fire, and in the various layers where there's fire, there's also red ochre, which is used for makeup, and there's very specific shells that are in these layers, and when I say specific, there's more diverse shells in the water, which is right nearby, where someone or a group that lived in these caves were selecting just certain seafood to take back to the 180,000-year-old clam bake. So there's pretty good evidence that we've been, or our ancestors has been consuming shellfish, well, let's say since our brain was expanding. So, okay, so I had to get that lick in, but anyway. Okay, let's see. Do we have any other in the audience?
Yes, Dr. Brenna. Deanna online is asking the panel, what would you tell consumer today on how they can purchase more sustainable seafood in the simplest way? What's the easiest way for them to find sustainable seafood?
Sorry, I'm having a second conversation here. Oh, the answer's on here? Oh.
Well, tell us the answer.
Okay. Who heard the question?
It was, how do we know the seafood, what's the guidance on sustainable seafood?
Oh, yeah, what's the guidance on sustainable seafood?
Yeah, in the simplest way possible. I think that was the challenging part of the question because it's not simple. It's really not simple. But I think there's a couple of good places to look, right? I encourage people to look for certification, right? There's two that are out there that you'll commonly see, Best Aquaculture Practices or Aquaculture Stewardship Council. If you can't see that, use the Monterey Bay Seafood Watch Guide. If you can't find that, you probably can't go too wrong buying U.S. seafood.
Well, my Whole Foods has sustainable plastered all over the seafood area, so
They have so Whole Foods has their own internal ranking system. They've done, some internal benchmarking on it. Other retailers tend to use the BAP certification or the ASC certification for their benchmarks.
So since you are at least a little familiar with that, are most retailers of seafood responsible in that way? And most retailers don't want to be known as irresponsible.
Yeah, moving that direction. More work to be done. A lot of the large retailers are increasingly, looking for one of those two standards and incorporating that into their buying practices. Not all, but a number of them are, and that momentum is increasing. I think that the challenge now will be are the standards the right ones, and are they keeping up with the times and the latest sustainability practices that are out there? So one thing the Nature Conservancy is doing is engaging in efforts to opine and revise those standards based on the best available science and push them to the next level of sustainability. Not just, this is the benchmark, we reached it, that was a standard that was written years ago, and that's sufficient. So that's part of our work as an environmental organization, is to work with those organizations to make sure they're rising to the occasion.
Oh, the answer I put on your paper, that I did see the question. So for the conservation lines for seafood solutions, 80 to 90% of retail and food service operators have a sustainable seafood policy in place. And so one way to buy sustainable seafood is to work with your major retailer. And we have Rick Stein here from FMI, the Food Industry Association. And so he can concur with that his members have been working very hard to have the sustainable seafood supply policy in place, and these seafood buyers work so hard to make sure they look at, the sourcing, the certifications. I mean, the work that they do is just so technical and intense. And I don't know, Rick, if you want to, Jessica's going to give you a mic here.
Yeah, the retailers, it's what your customer finds interesting, you find fascinating. And so the customer base has gotten much more concerned about sustainable food products across the store. And seafood had gone down that path before the center of the store had to prove that it was sustainably sourced. What's getting mixed into it is the social compliance piece. And so now consumers are taking social compliance and mixing it up with sustainable fisheries. And so our members are really working on both types of certifications to make sure. And the good news is what the pandemic did is it drove a lot of people to digital shopping. You can communicate a lot more of what you're doing in sustainability in the digital platform than you can at the seafood counter. So, you know, I'm always challenged. I know Whole Foods does a great job of their particular proprietary program, but you go to a lot of seafood counters and there's a little decal, and if you ask the clerk, is your seafood sustainable? He'll go, I don't know, you know. But if you go to the digital platforms, you're going to see almost not just the big retailers, but you're going to see the independent operators are working on this just as hard as the big ones. So the Krogers, the Walmarts, the Albertsons, and Safeways. And then you have all these little independents that are doing it as well. So I think the retailers are fully committed to a sustainable source.
Well, that's really very comforting.
Yeah.
And, okay, let's see. It's okay, I have another question. I think for Maya, how did fruit and vegetables get more attention in the U.S. food policy and guidelines? And I think you sort of alluded to some of it, but could you expand on at least your speculation,
Yeah.
seeing as you probably,
Well, you know,
well, you might have been there.
what I think it is, you know, I was digging through the old dietary guidelines and I was looking at the 2005 to 2010 versus the 2010 to 2015 guidelines, and it looks like the seafood just got blown up in the 2015 edition. It was a little bit in the previous edition, but I think, you know, when you talk about, like, you know, chicken being a mature technology and being further ahead, like, I think fruits and vegetables are just ahead time-wise, and that it's just getting on the scene in 2015. The government, it moves slowly. So it's probably, you know, it's great that we are where we are, and I think it's a great launching off point for building on what's in the guidelines, but it is relatively recent.
So that's a very encouraging answer, because that means we're launched now and we can move forward, right?
Right, but I do think that there's intensive effort and deliberate effort that has gone into making getting vegetables where they are. I don't think it just happens. So I do think it requires sustained effort, but I think that it's, you know, just relatively recent having that great place in the dietary guidelines.
That vegetables took a while. Those of us of a certain age remembered the can of peas.
Mm-hmm. Ketchup.
Well, ketchup is a vegetable. Yes, of course. We're fruit. Yeah. Okay, I'll leave that one where it is. But it really has actually improved dramatically, and certainly in my lifetime, in the way people think about it, but also emphasize vegetables. So perhaps there's a real hope for the seafood story. Okay, let's see. I have another question. Where are the potential innovations that you've seen with the blue food movement? I'd say that's Hugh.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I spoke a little bit about what Verimeris does and the fact that, you know, we took microbes that we found under a rock in a river in Oregon, did a little genetic modification to have the capacity to produce a super high EPA, DHA, omega-3 that's stable and that we can introduce into aquaculture feed. I think we can do much more with microbiology to push the blue food movement. I also think that there's new integrated programs where you're, you know, mixing bivalve production with fish production, so you get nutrient uptake from the bivalves, and a whole bunch of integrated systems that we can look like. So it's not just innovation in terms of science innovation, I think it's also process innovation and business model innovation.
And I'm going to throw one in from myself. You alluded to the World Economic Forum that you were recently attended. I spent 90 minutes at one of those things earlier this week, and it was sort of a kickoff to think about the future of nutrition. And after all the usual stuff about heart disease and things like that, I sort of raised my hand and said, well, what about the brain and nutrition from the neck up, which I get from my friend Joe Hiblin. And do you hear anything, see anything? Do you think it's in the circles that you're traveling in there, which are a little different than the ones I'm traveling in there, do you see that is something that we may be able to advance, move forward, that we may get some traction for once?
Yeah, no, I mean, early on in SMP, right, a good part of our campaigns was around brain health.
Right.
And And we all grew up with the idea that fish were brain food, and it had some traction there. But I think historically in the nutrition community, we were very much focused on cardiovascular health. And you saw a lot of the energy, time, energy, and effort, even around omega-3s, focused on cardiovascular health. That's evolved and is evolving very quickly, where now there's far more focus on cognitive health, on mental health, on disease prevention through the intervention of nutrition, not just omega-3, but the whole host of essential nutrients. I think that going forward will be the priority and the focus of those who set policy and governments, because they understand that the impact can be relatively quick if handled appropriately. And it just costs the U.S. $300 billion a year to address dementia, Alzheimer's, and other cognitive disease. We have ways to mitigate that through proper nutrition. So I do think it's getting a lot more traction, both here as well as abroad.
And you see it even in these groups like WEF at all? Have you heard some of these kinds of things? I'm pushing you a little bit on it.
No, I mean, it's starting to pick up. I mean, I have to be very careful what I say. I don't want to unintentionally malign anybody, but I do think that sometimes the World Economic Forum can be a lagging indicator as to the direction that the science is developing. I think a lot of the work that you do in Texas and elsewhere is really extremely leading on the impact of the use of omega-3s on mental health, but also on cognitive health as well.
Okay. Any other, not on the WEF, I suppose, but any other comments along those lines?
Well, I think we were talking about tech and aquaculture, and I think there's a lot of exciting stuff to be thinking about there. Whether it's systems, there's new technologies like recirculating systems that allow you to produce fish on land and eliminate some of the environmental issues historically associated with fish waste and genetic interactions. There's several of them developing here in the United States, or offshore technologies similar to what Forever Oceans is working on, get farms into vast ocean currents. Those are going to be exciting technologies and things to watch going forward in this space. And then also on the supply chain end, feeds is really the issue for the environmental footprint of these operations. And we encourage any of the technology developments to transition to more sustainable, lower carbon feeds, but also ones that provide the nutritional health for the fish and for humans along the way.
Very good. So we're making some progress in recognizing mental illness as the chronic condition that it actually is, and recognizing that we have to support brain health. And well, of course, in my presentation, I was arguing that it's the thing we ought to support, and the rest will follow. I pretty much think that's probably right. Do we have any other questions or comments from?
Time for 2 more questions.
I'll just add this.
Please.
When you talk about brain health, one point I don't think we've really talked about so much today. We talked about the stress of COVID, but also the disease of COVID. It's a brain disease. And, in terms of it's having neurological impacts throughout the population. And I'm also wondering, how much of seafood could be maybe helpful in maybe mitigating that or preventing that, but COVID has neurological and brain effects that we're hearing about more and more. And does that beg the role for seafood as a preventative, as a treatment, as a, something that plays a role there?
That's a great point. The brain fog is now a diagnosis of long COVID.
And not just brain fog, but losing your sense of taste and smell is a neurological issue that is occurring right there, and a serious one.
I have a question for you, Tom.
Yes, sir.
All of this great information, I'm learning so much myself here. How do we get this in the hands of physicians who are in the primary caregivers, who are really sort of the pointy edge of the spear on advising people, you should eat more fish, you should eat more shellfish, you should supplement with omega-3s. I mean, it was remarkable, with Dr. Hiblin last night as the awardee, to learn that, expectant mothers who consume seafood have children with IQ 7 points higher. I think if the general population knew that, we would begin to see radical change. How do we work with those primary care physicians, those primary caregivers, to ensure that they can provide the education and information that's really going to drive change, I think?
I've already made a comment that my feeling is that some specialties are better than others, like the pediatricians are always thinking about food at one level or another, and development in general. A second thing, however, is to engage, let's call it the popularizers. So Dr. Drew Ramsey, for instance, the book writers that are physicians, but can take the science and translate it into something that's a simple diagram, because although he did use a polysyllabic word and a few things along those lines, neuroplasticity, right? Which rolls off my tongue, but maybe not everybody's. But he is the kind of guy who can, and Uma Naidu in Boston is another one who writes books on these things, and these are more popular, but they also speak to the physicians as well. I'd love to be able to draw in the OBGYNs. I haven't figured out how to do that yet. I sometimes in frustration think they ought to know better. So if everyone's got a solution to doing that, I would love to hear it, but I think...
But now's the time, right? I mean, we have a unique moment in time next week on the 28th, where the White House is going to hold a conference on hunger, nutrition, and health, and they're going to announce the national strategy across 20 agencies. Now is the time to begin to promote seafood and omega-3 products to ensure that physicians are the ones who are carrying the message forward. Because I know, like, I come from a giant family. I have 8 brothers and sisters. I couldn't even tell you by this point how many nieces and nephews I have, but they keep coming. I tell them to eat seafood when they're expecting, and the reaction is, ooh, that's dangerous. I don't want to get mercury. I'm like, we have to find a way to counter that narrative, which still exists.
If you're going to be in the room, you can say it then.
Nobody listens to me. You know that by now. Okay.
Well, but in this case, Dari Mastafarian is going to be more or less chairing this thing, and he's one of seafood's biggest fans.
He is.
And so all you need to do is remind him. And after he gets done talking about the heart, he's a cardiologist, so we have to let him talk about the heart. We can remind him that there's a heart above the above the neck or something along those lines, and I'm sure he will enthusiastically embrace that. Do we have a comment from Joe?
So thank you for that question. And it's, you know, I've been having at this for almost 30 years. And what my experience has been largely in psychiatry is that if I, as one physician, come and I'm on one panel and I'm a one-off about nutrition, it's like I'm waving magnets over somebody's head, you know, and I'm just this goofy one-off person doing it. My experience in these past 2 days of seeing brain health as a priority and nutrition as a brain health and priority, and not just as one person as a physician, but the entire effort of how are we changing economies, how are we putting this into nature, the impact and the seriousness of doing this as a team and presenting this to a major psychiatric meeting as a coordinated team of brain health will blow their minds. They don't get it. As Drew Ramsey was saying, the APA has no dietary guidelines whatsoever. The fact that the brain is something more than a receptor for pharmacological agents, that's the biology of the brain. There is no paradigm shift, there is no knowledge of the brain needing to eat, that it gets 20% of heartbeat. So I think that a good way forward is to act as a team and create something at a major psychiatric meeting and then follow it up by very simple continuing medical education credits for learning about brain nutrition. And it's always this issue of how do you shift culture and belief of frame of reference, but those I would suggest as a good way forward.
I nominate you for bringing this forward. We'll be right behind you. And I think that's all the time we have, correct?
We had one commentary from the
Okay.
chat. It's too long for me to write. It's from Andrea Tomlinson on the chat. Hello, everybody. I'm so sorry to have missed this event in person this year. I'm on virtual. I would like to point out that the Monterey Bay Seafood Watch is actually not considered to be a reputable or accurate label in the majority of the commercial fishing industry. Several evaluations on the New England fisheries are based on antiquated and inaccurate data. The recent red listing of the American lobster in the Gulf of Maine is an example of inaccurate labeling, and I have encountered several others. I know that is a contentious issue right now, and so I don't have a comment on that right now. Does anyone?
Hence contributory to confusion.
Yes, there's a lot of confusing facts in the
Right.
industry that we have to address.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a comment from Andrea. Does anyone else have comment they like to make? I think, so there, I guess I'll just point out,
Yeah,
sure.
I'd like to make a comment and love to get your feedback on it. So FMI does a lot of research with consumers. We kind of ask them a bunch of questions about why they're shopping and what they're thinking about. A couple things that really resonate, we've been doing it for about 5 years now, so we're asking the same questions year over year and seeing how it moves. One of the things is the affordability of seafood, and that is an underpinning into their lack of knowledge. So they'll tell you, I'm afraid to buy seafood because it's so expensive on it, and they think of it on a per pound basis. And we know we have some retailers that are doing portion, you know, like $7.99 for the portion as opposed to $26.99 a pound. But the idea that they're not confident they can prepare it right is also financially based. I don't want to spend that much money and then go home and ruin my seafood. So I'm kind of interested because you're talking about how do we get more seafood into consumers. And I think affordability is a big issue there. And I think that's why government's doing more programs around fruits and vegetables, because it's an economic decision. I'd be interested in your opinion on that concept. And the other thing, and you just brought it up, Linda, consumers are telling us they get multiple messages. So they have one group telling them that seafood's sustainable, and then they hear other articles and other people saying it's not sustainable. And they hear about certifications are accurate, and then they hear certifications are not accurate, which is adding to this, the average consumer doesn't spend, like we do, a lot of time in the area of seafood. So I'd just be interested on your take on those comments.
Yeah, what you were saying about the risk of buying something that you may or may not know how to prepare or, may not like. In my previous employment, I was at Partnership for a Healthier America, and there's a program that they were running where folks get 12 weeks of free fruits and vegetables. They got to experiment. They got to taste, they would never buy a pineapple before because they didn't know if their kids would like it, but it just came, and then they found out that their kids did like it, so now it's not an experiment, so they will now go and buy that later. But it was sort of this risk-free trial kind of thing. Now, of course, it'd be very expensive to send people box of seafood every week for free for 12 weeks. But people would probably learn what they liked, what they didn't like, and it would be risk-free, and then, maybe continue to buy the ones that went well. But I think you're absolutely right, that people are hesitant.
What was interesting was during the pandemic, seafood sales at retail skyrocketed. Pounds, units, dollars, the whole thing. And everyone was saying that now that people are learning to cook seafood, it'll have some stickiness to it. We're back to pre-pandemic levels, and it's the inflation. Yeah. Seafood, overall grocery went up 13%, but seafood went even higher than that since pre-pandemic. So what we're seeing is they're moving back from seafood back into meat departments because it's more affordable. So I think there's a lot of things we have to tackle. And I love the idea of promoting the idea behind brain health, because there's a lot of social consciousness around that now with anxiety and our society being fractured a little bit. I think that's a great message, but I think we have to address the affordability.
Gretchen, you have a question? Oh, okay. Jessica's coming over. And then I have just one more question from chat.
I just want to kind of respond to the comment we just had. I've been a dietitian working with omega-3 in seafood for 20 years. I get the pushback and the excuses people have and the confusion. Affordability is a real issue. But I just need to say that as leaders, we're the leaders in the room here. And we need to stop being paralyzed by confusion and act. Let's use the resources and programs that we have. They may not be perfect, but they're good and they're going to get better. And we need to use it, we need to act, we need to celebrate seafood. You know, the nutrition in seafood it's very nutritious and it's saving lives. We need to eat seafood.
Thank you. I think he wanted me to come up. Thank you, Gretchen.
Here.
On Andrea's last question, I think it's at a technical level that a consumer, it's hard for them to understand. I mean, Jackie at MSC does a good job. There are ratings and there are certifications, and the Monterey Bay system is a rating, and then there's this actual certification. So we, you know, Gretchen, you're exactly right. We need to actually just engage in conversation, not be afraid of it, but engage with them. And so, yeah. Yeah.
And then we don't act, and then we don't get the benefit.
That's right.
It's insanity.
So, but we're moving, we're moving. I think, I don't know if you can answer this question from Fiona Robinson. She's the Sea Share. How do we incentivize seafood companies to donate seafood to food banks, given the post-pandemic increase in food prices? Feeding America gets 2 million pounds per year from Sea Share, but needs 200 million pounds to meet the USDA dietary guidelines. So we're a little short at the food banks.
Not for me.
I have no idea. I'm only.
That may be just a commentary.
Okay.
That's something we need
We'll
to work
take it as
on.
rhetorical comments.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, but thank you. I think
Rhetorical
that's
question.
all the time we have for
Okay,
the panel
very
questions.
good.
Thank you
Thanks
so
so
much.
much.
You're doing a lot for the Sea Share.